The human brain has a fatal flaw. It believes it is invincible. We are about to observe that flaw getting 6 people eaten alive by reality. These are not accidents. They are a challenge to the natural order, performed before a cheering crowd. We will analyze the exact instant their showmanship turned them into prey. Watch closely. This is what happens when you treat your life like a toy. June 24th, 1994, was a day of blinding sun and the heavy metallic smell of jet fuel at Fairchild Air Force Base. On the parched grass, hundreds of people sat in lawn chairs. They were families of airmen, shielding their eyes to see the Air Force's most powerful weapon. The B-52 Stratofortress was a massive 8-engine bomber, a titan of the Cold War. This was a routine rehearsal for an upcoming air show. It was supposed to be a simple display of military precision, but the man in the cockpit, Lieutenant Colonel Bud Holland, did not believe in routine. Holland was a pilot with legendary technical skills and a dangerous, unchecked ego. He was a man who lived for the spectacle. To him, the 180-ton aircraft was not a delicate instrument of physics. It was a toy he could bend to his will. Over the years, he had built a reputation for breaking safety rules. He performed illegal low-level stunts that terrified his own crew. On this afternoon, Holland wanted to push the B-52 beyond its physical breaking point. He wanted to impress the watching crowd and his superiors. The B-52 is a flying fortress. It has a wingspan of 185 feet. It was designed to drop bombs from high altitudes, not to perform like a stunt plane. Every aircraft has a limit called a bank angle. This is how much the wings can tilt before they stop generating lift. For a plane this size, the safety limit is 45 degrees. Holland planned to ignore that limit. He took off into the blue Washington sky. The 8 engines produced a deafening, rhythmic roar that shook the earth. He began a maneuver called a 360-degree turn around the base's control tower. As the plane approached the tower at only 250 feet, Holland banked the aircraft hard to the left. The crowd watched as the massive wings tilted further and further. At 60 degrees, the plane was in extreme danger. At 70 degrees, the heavy airframe began to groan under the stress. Inside the cockpit, the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. The co-pilot, Mark McGeehan, had previously requested never to fly with Holland again. He knew Holland's history of reckless behavior. Now, he was trapped in a metal tomb. The plane's stall warning system began to scream. It was a high-pitched electronic wail. It signaled that air was no longer flowing over the wings. The control column vibrated violently in Holland's hands. Time seemed to slow down into a series of agonizing microseconds. Holland pushed the engines to full power. This was a desperate attempt to force the plane through the turn. But he had already tilted the aircraft to a near vertical 90-degree angle. At this point, the wings were pointing straight up and down. They were no longer acting as wings. They were just giant pieces of metal cutting through the air. Gravity took control. The 180-ton bomber stalled. It began to slide sideways out of the sky. In a final act of survival, the co-pilot attempted to eject. The hatch blew open, but there was no time for the seat to fire. The aircraft plummeted toward the Earth just a few hundred yards from a nuclear weapons facility. The transition from human ambition to physical consequence was instantaneous. When the left wingtip struck the dry soil, the aircraft underwent total structural failure. The kinetic energy caused the airframe to disintegrate immediately. Thousands of gallons of jet fuel ignited in a split second. A massive orange fireball rose 300 feet into the air. All 4 crew members sustained catastrophic blunt force trauma upon impact. The force of the collision resulted in an immediate fatal injury for everyone on board. The cockpit structure was compromised by the immense mechanical pressure. There was no struggle. The cessation of all biological functions occurred at the millisecond of contact. The fireball consumed the remains of the aircraft. Nothing was left but blackened shards of aluminum scattered across the scorched earth. The roar of the engines was replaced by a terrifying, hollow silence. On the ground, the families of the airmen stood in shock. Their cheers were replaced by screams. They had just watched their loved ones disappear in a wall of flame. The control tower stood unmarked and indifferent as the black smoke drifted past. In the weeks that followed, the military launched a massive investigation. They found a long history of warnings that were ignored. Safety protocols had been laughed at. The attitude of reckless showmanship had finally met the cold, unyielding wall of aerodynamics. Today, the crash of ZAR 52 is a mandatory lesson for every military pilot. It is a lesson in the dangers of ego. The site of the crash has been cleared, but the memory remains. It is a frozen frame of a 180-ton giant falling from the sky. One man believed he was more powerful than the laws of the universe. All that remained was a legacy of ash and a set of flight rules written in the names of those who did not have to die. On April 28, 2013, the Coronation Bridge in West Bengal became the stage for a grim spectacle of human pride colliding with mechanical reality. Below the massive concrete arches, the Teesta River churned in a violent, muddy torrent. Above it stood Sailendra Nath Roy, a 49-year-old stuntman who had built his entire identity around a single physical trait: the strength of his hair. Roy was a local legend and a Guinness World Record holder who had pulled trains and heavy trucks using only his ponytail. He had convinced himself that his body was an exception to the biological rules that govern ordinary men. On this hot afternoon, he prepared for his most dangerous exhibition yet. He planned to cross a 600-foot gap over the river on a zip wire, suspended entirely by his hair. There was no safety harness. There was no net. There was only a steel cable and a homemade pulley system attached to his scalp. Roy believed his neck muscles were stronger than the laws of physics. He waved to the cheering crowd, a man drunk on his own invincibility, and launched himself into the void. For the first few moments, the stunt seemed to be another triumph. He glided along the wire, 70 feet above the rushing water. But the system he trusted with his life contained a hidden, fatal defect. The pulley wheel was not designed for this specific load or angle. As Roy reached the midpoint of the wire, the friction caused the wheel to heat up and seize. The rhythmic whirring sound stopped instantly. Roy jerked to a violent halt, stranded in the dead center of the chasm. He was now a dead weight hanging by his hair roots. The crowd on the bridge erupted in applause. They filmed with their phones, assuming this sudden stop was part of the show, a dramatic pause to heighten the tension. They did not see the panic that instantly flooded Roy's eyes. He was trapped. He tried to reach up and pull himself forward with his hands, but the angle of the wire was too steep and his body was too heavy. The physics of the situation had turned against him. He was fighting a losing battle against gravity, and his only connection to the world was the searing pain in his scalp. For nearly 45 minutes, Roy struggled in plain sight. He kicked his legs and shouted, but the roar of the river below drowned out his voice. The spectators continued to watch, unaware that they were documenting a man's slow death. Inside Roy's body, a catastrophic physiological chain reaction began. The extreme physical exertion, combined with the panic of being trapped, caused his adrenaline levels to spike to toxic levels. His heart was beating so fast it could not refill with blood between pumps. His muscles were starved of oxygen. He was experiencing supreme physical exhaustion. The stuntman who believed he was made of steel was being dismantled by simple biology. Finally, his cardiovascular system reached its absolute limit. He suffered a massive myocardial infarction. The blood flow to his heart muscles stopped. His movements ceased. His arms dropped to his sides, and his head slumped forward. To the crowd, it looked like he was meditating or resting. In reality, the exhibition had ended in clinical death. He hung there swaying gently in the wind, a lifeless object suspended above the indifferent river. It took rescue teams nearly an hour to bring him down. When they finally reached him, there was no pulse to restore. They did not rescue a man, they recovered a body. Sailendra Nath Roy died not because he wasn't strong, but because he ignored the basic reality of mechanical risk. He trusted a rusted pulley more than he respected his own life. The tragedy remains recorded on hundreds of phones, a digital archive of a crowd cheering for a man who was dying right in front of them. It is a cold reminder that the line between a hero and a victim is often just one seized bearing. He wanted the world to look at him, and they did. They watched him until the very end, unable to distinguish his agony from his performance. On July 9, 1993, the afternoon sun cast long, golden stripes across the polished floors of the Toronto Dominion Centre. From the 24th floor, the city of Toronto was a silent, sprawling map of concrete and steel. The air inside the offices of the Holden Day Wilson law firm smelled of old paper, leather, and ambition. It was a space of calculated order and immense corporate power. In this cathedral of commerce, 38-year-old Gary Hoy was a senior partner, a man known for his expertise in corporate and securities law. But Gary was also a showman trapped in a lawyer's suit. He possessed a deep-seated need to impress, to be seen as more than just a man who argued over contracts. On this day, he was giving a tour to a group of new articling students, young minds he wanted to mold and, more importantly, dazzle. To demonstrate the marvels of modern engineering, he had a party trick. He would show them the unbreakable glass. The panoramic windows of the tower were a testament to safety and strength. They were thick, laminated panes designed to withstand the brutal Canadian winters and hurricane-force winds. They were, for all practical purposes, a solid wall of transparent steel. Gary had performed his stunt many times before. It was a simple, terrifying display. He would take a running start and hurl his 160-pound body directly at the window. He would bounce off harmlessly, leaving the students gasping in a mixture of horror and admiration. His repeated success had created a dangerous illusion of total safety. He stood before the students, a confident smile on his face. He told them to watch closely. He backed up, creating a small runway in the middle of the office. He took a short run. He slammed his shoulder into the glass. A deep, solid thump echoed through the room. The glass flexed slightly but held firm. Gary bounced back onto the carpet, laughing. The students were amazed. The legend was true. But for Gary, one demonstration wasn't enough. The first impact was just the warm-up. He decided to do it again, this time with more force. This was the bifurcation point, the single moment where his fate was irrevocably sealed. He took a longer run-up. His shoes pounded against the plush carpet. He focused all his energy into his shoulder and launched himself at the window for a second time. The impact was much harder. The kinetic energy from his body transferred directly into the window assembly. The glass itself did not break. It did not shatter. It did not even crack. Gary Hoy was right about the strength of the glass, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had tested only one part of a complex system. A window is not just a pane of glass. It is a pane of glass held in place by a frame. The second, more powerful impact sent a shock wave through the entire unit. The aluminum window frame, the very structure holding the unbreakable glass in place, failed under the concentrated load. The sound was not the sharp crash of shattering glass. It was a low, sickening pop. The entire window assembly, glass and frame together, blew out of the building's curtain wall. In that split second, the solid surface Gary expected to hit was gone. It was replaced by 24 stories of empty air. The low hum of the city instantly became a roaring wind that tore through the office. The transition to the final outcome was swift and absolute. Gary Hoy fell 100 meters. The cause of death was massive and catastrophic blunt force trauma resulting from the impact with the concrete courtyard below. The structural integrity of the human body was completely compromised by the fall, and the cessation of all vital functions was instantaneous. Back in the office, the students stood frozen in disbelief, staring at the perfect rectangular hole in the side of the skyscraper. Papers were whipped off desks, swirling in the violent gust of wind. The secure, orderly world of their corporate future had been shattered. The artifact of this tragedy was the empty space itself, a silent testament to a hidden weakness in a system everyone trusted. Gary Hoy fell with the very pane of glass he had proven was unbreakable. The story became a dark legend in the legal and engineering worlds, a cautionary tale about the difference between strength and integrity. The law firm implemented new safety procedures, but for Gary, the rules were rewritten a few seconds too late. His final act was not a demonstration of strength, but a fatal lesson in the simple, brutal laws of physics. On September 23, 2010, the high plains of Casper, Wyoming, were battered by a relentless, howling gale. Standing 800 feet above the scrubland was the KTWO radio tower, a skeletal lattice of red and white steel held in place by massive guy wires that hummed in the wind. At the base of the tower stood John Stanley, a 68-year-old veteran of the sky. Stanley was not a thrill-seeking teenager. He was a highly respected figure in the world of parachuting with over 2,500 recorded jumps. He had spent a lifetime navigating the atmosphere, and this experience had calcified into a dangerous form of arrogance. To Stanley, the laws of aerodynamics were not constraints, but variables he could manipulate. On this particular day, the wind was gusting between 40 and 50 miles per hour. These conditions created a chaotic turbulence profile around the tower. Such weather is considered suicidal for base jumping, a sport that requires calm air for the parachute to deploy and steer correctly away from the structure. Stanley's friends and fellow jumpers on the ground pleaded with him to abort the mission. They pointed to the swaying cables and the violent whipping of the windsock. They told him it was impossible, but Stanley, driven by the fatal need to prove that his experience superseded the weather, dismissed their concerns. He believed that his reaction time was faster than the wind. He climbed the service ladder, a long, arduous ascent that gave him ample time to reconsider, yet his resolve only hardened. When he reached the exit point, the wind was screaming through the steel grating. It was a physical force that pushed against his chest. He checked his gear, a specialized parachute rig designed for rapid deployment, and prepared to jump. He looked down at his friends, a final gesture of defiance, and stepped off the edge. For the first second, gravity did its work, accelerating him toward the earth. He threw his pilot chute, and the main canopy extracted from the container. This was the moment of convergence where human error met fluid dynamics. In a standard jump, the parachute inflates and flies forward, carrying the jumper away from the tower. But in a 50-mile-per-hour headwind, the parachute does not fly forward. It becomes a massive sail. The wind caught the nylon cells of the canopy and instantly inflated them with violent force. Instead of gliding away, the parachute was overwhelmed by the drag vector. The wind stopped his forward momentum entirely and then reversed it. It was a cruel reversal of physics. The very device meant to save his life became the engine of his destruction. Stanley was swung backward like a pendulum toy, right back toward the jagged steel structure he had just jumped from. He had less than 2 seconds to react, but there is no maneuver in the manual for a parachute flying backward at highway speeds. He collided with the radio tower with catastrophic velocity. The impact was not a glancing blow. It was a direct, high-energy collision between a fragile biological organism and an immovable steel lattice. The forensic reality of the event is brutal in its simplicity. Stanley suffered immediate, massive blunt force trauma to the torso and cranium. The kinetic energy of the impact shattered his skeletal structure and compromised his internal organs instantly. He did not fall to the ground. In a final, macabre twist of fate, his parachute snagged on the sharp metal of the tower's crossbeams. The lines tangled, and the canopy inflated against the steel, holding his lifeless body suspended hundreds of feet in the air. The wind that had killed him continued to howl, holding his body suspended against the steel structure. Below, his friends watched in helpless horror. The silence of the desert was broken only by the sound of the wind and the metallic clanging of the rig against the tower. It took rescue crews hours to figure out how to retrieve him from such a precarious position, as the wind made it too dangerous to climb. When they finally brought him down, it was a recovery operation, not a rescue. John Stanley had wanted to show that he was the master of the air. Instead, he became a grim marker of the limit where skill ends and physics begins. His death serves as a chilling reminder to the base jumping community. Nature does not respect your resume. The wind does not care how many jumps you have logged. It only cares about mass, drag, and velocity. Stanley bet his life that he could outsmart the atmosphere. The atmosphere answered with a gust that turned a veteran into a tragic statistic suspended in the gray Wyoming sky. The tower still stands today. A silent witness to the day a man looked at a storm and said, "Look at me," only to be silenced by the very element he thought he had conquered. On October 14, 2004, a Bombardier CRJ-200 jet cut through the night sky over the American Midwest. Flight 3701 was a ferry flight, moving the empty plane from Little Rock to Minneapolis for maintenance. There were no passengers, no flight attendants, and no witnesses. In the cockpit sat Captain Jesse Rhodes, 31, and First Officer Peter Cesars, 23. They were young, qualified pilots, but on this night, they were not acting like professionals. They were treating the $20 million airliner like a private toy. Without the watchful eyes of passengers, discipline vanished. They decided to turn the routine transfer into a joyride. Their goal was to join the unofficial 410 Club, a badge of honor among reckless pilots who pushed the jet to its maximum altitude of 41,000 feet. This altitude is the absolute limit of the plane's capability, a zone where the air is dangerously thin and the engines are prone to failure. Rhodes and Cesars initiated an aggressive, steep climb. They set the vertical speed to nearly double the standard rate. The engine screamed at maximum thrust to fight gravity. As the plane clawed its way up, the air density dropped rapidly. The engines began to struggle for oxygen. The plane was begging for relief, but the pilots ignored the physics of the situation. They were laughing and joking, caught up in the thrill. When they finally reached 41,000 feet, the aircraft was exhausted. It was flying too slowly to maintain lift. The plane's computer recognized the danger and activated the stick pusher, a safety device that automatically forces the nose down to gain speed. In a moment of fatal arrogance, the pilots physically fought the system. They pulled the nose back up, overriding the computer's attempt to save them. This was the tipping point. The airflow into the General Electric engines was disrupted. Starved of air, both engines flamed out simultaneously. The roar of the jet was replaced by the terrifying hiss of the wind. The cockpit went dark as the generators failed. At this altitude, the outside air temperature was nearly 60 degrees below zero. This extreme cold triggered a catastrophic mechanical phenomenon known as core lock. The engines, running hot from the climb, were suddenly shocked by the freezing air. The outer metal casing cooled and contracted faster than the inner turbine rotors. The casing clamped down on the spinning blades, seizing the engines solid. They were no longer engines, they were dead weight. Rhodes and Cesars were now commanding a 20-ton glider falling from the edge of space. For the next 12 minutes, the pilots frantically tried to restart the engines. They pitched the nose down to spin the turbines, but it was useless. The rotors were locked tight by the thermal contraction. They had turned a temporary flameout into a permanent failure. The black box recorded the shift from bravado to panic. The jokes about the 410 Club were replaced by breathless profanity. They were falling at thousands of feet per minute. They declared an emergency, but were too far from any major airport. They aimed for a small airfield in Jefferson City, Missouri, but they had too much speed and too little control. The descent was a long, silent funeral procession. The pilots realized too late that their ego had written a check the aircraft could not cash. At 10:15 p.m., the silence ended. The jet crashed into a residential neighborhood just short of the runway. The impact was violent and absolute. The aircraft struck the ground, cartwheeled, and disintegrated into a fireball. The forensic reality is that the sudden deceleration caused immediate, fatal blunt force trauma to both men. The cockpit became their tomb. The fire consumed the wreckage, leaving only the data recorders to tell the story. Miraculously, no one on the ground was killed. The investigation revealed that the pilots had acted with a gross disregard for safety. The 410 Club was not an achievement. It was a death sentence. Rhodes and Caesars wanted to touch the edge of the sky. They succeeded, but they forgot the golden rule of aviation. Takeoffs are optional, but landings are mandatory. They died because they believed their skill could override the thermal properties of metal. The wreckage was cleared, but Flight 3701 remains a dark warning in flight schools. The laws of physics do not care how confident you are. If you treat a jetliner like a toy, it will eventually break you. On November 28, 2006, the vibrant streets of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, were buzzing with the usual energy of the city. But in a small performance space, a man named Ali Khan Samsudin was preparing to challenge death itself. Known globally as the Snake King, Samsudin was a superstar of the extreme world. He held Guinness World Records for living in glass enclosures with thousands of scorpions and hundreds of cobras. He claimed to have been bitten 99 times over his career. This history had created a dangerous delusion. Samsudin truly believed his body had developed a supernatural immunity to snake venom. He saw himself as biologically superior to the reptiles he handled. To him, a cobra was not a lethal predator. It was a prop for his ego. On this day, he was performing with a king cobra. This is not just any snake. It is the longest venomous snake in the world, capable of delivering enough neurotoxin in a single bite to kill an elephant. During the show, the cobra struck. It bit Samsudin on his left hand. The audience gasped in horror, but Samsudin did not flinch. He did not call for help. He simply pulled the snake away and smiled. He told the crowd, "It's just a little bite." This was his ultimate declaration of invincibility. He wanted to prove that he was untouchable. But biology does not care about fame. The venom coursing through his veins was a potent chemical weapon designed by millions of years of evolution. Its job is to shut down the nervous system of any living thing. A normal person would have rushed to the hospital for antivenom immediately. Samsudin did not. He refused medical treatment. He was convinced his immunity would neutralize the poison. He went home, ignoring the throbbing pain. He even gave interviews to reporters, boasting about his strength while the venom silently spread. The latent variable in his logic was the sheer potency of the king cobra's toxin. This was not a minor nip from a garden snake. It was a massive dose of death. As the hours passed, the neurotoxins began to bind to his muscle receptors, blocking signals from his brain. The first signs were subtle: heavy eyelids, a dry mouth, trouble swallowing. His family begged him to go to the hospital, but his pride held him back. He wanted to wake up the next morning and say, "I told you so." But by the second day, the Snake King could no longer ignore the reality. His arm had swollen to a critical level, and severe tissue necrosis began to set in. The pain was excruciating, like a fire burning inside his skin. Finally, realizing that his immunity was a myth, he allowed his family to take him to the hospital. But the clock had run out. The venom had already caused irreversible damage. His kidneys were failing. The paralysis was creeping toward his lungs. The doctors fought to save him, but the window for effective treatment had closed 24 hours earlier. On the third day, the final stage of the interaction began. The neurotoxins reached his diaphragm, the muscle responsible for breathing. Samsudin, the man who claimed to be stronger than death, found himself unable to draw a breath. He was fully conscious, trapped in a body that was slowly turning into stone. The forensic reality of a cobra bite is a terrifying form of suffocation. The brain screams for oxygen, but the muscles refuse to move. Life ceased not with a dramatic bang, but with a silent, desperate gasp. The Snake King died on December 1, 2006. He was 48 years old. His death was not an accident. It was a choice. He had bet his life on a biological impossibility. The snake that killed him was just an animal following its instinct. The man who died was a victim of his own belief that he was above the laws of nature. His legacy remains a cautionary tale. Immunity is a medical concept, not a magical shield. Shamsuddin wanted the world to watch his power. Instead, they watched the slow, agonizing collapse of a man who thought he could negotiate with chemistry. The king cobra survived. The king did not. These men spent decades building careers, but you only know them because of their worst 10 seconds. Their legacy is now just a file on a server. Is it better to live a long, boring life and be forgotten, or to die in a blaze of incompetence and be remembered by millions? It's a cruel choice. Vote below, glory or safety. Pick one. If you choose wisely, subscribe to the channel.